What specific steps will the NFL take to hold Mr. Snyder accountable for refusing to testify before Congress?
Madam Chairwoman, I do not have any responsibility for whether he appears before Congress. That is not my choice. That is his choice.
Let me stop you right here.
It has been a wild 24 hours, especially if you happen to be a Washington Commanders fan, because in the past 24 hours, you got yourself some good news that pertains directly to the on-field product of the Washington Commanders. And behind the scenes, I don't necessarily know if this is good news, but you have by far one of the most absurd moments that I think we've ever seen in NFL history, because the owner of the Washington Commanders is trying to curve Congress. I'm not even kidding. So before we get to the content, make sure you drop a like, subscribe, and turn on our notifications to help the channel grow. I don't upload content unless if there's news and updates to get to you guys, or a cool documentary that I want to send your way. We also upload shorter versions of this content onto my TikTok page, and recently we've been uploading it even to my YouTube and Instagram as shorts and reels. Now that we get all that out of the way, break! Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? We're gonna start this out with some good news for the Washington Commanders, because why not start this video out with a positive note? And one of the biggest questions surrounding the Washington Commanders, which wasn't necessarily up there with the likes of DK Metcalf and Deebo Samuel and AJ Brown, is what's to become of Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin is by far one of the most underrated wide receivers in the entire NFL. The reason I'm saying that is through his first 3 seasons in the NFL, in the 2019 season, he had 919 receiving yards. In the 2 years following that, he had over 1,000 yards receiving, and so far in his young career has had 16 touchdowns. The unfortunate thing is he's entering his age 27 season already, but through his 3-year stint in Washington, he has been one of the most consistent players in the entire NFL. Bear in mind that the Washington Commanders had a consistent revolving door at the quarterback position, and it doesn't matter if you had Alex Smith throwing passes to Terry McLaurin or Taylor Heineke. The man was as consistent as can be, and ultimately the Washington Commanders ended up rewarding him with a huge contract extension. And this is just the on-field aspect of Terry McLaurin's game. I mean, behind the scenes, we've been hearing that he's been an awesome teammate and an even better human being. And ultimately, the negotiations between the Washington Commanders and Terry McLaurin weren't that intense, because according to Adam Schefter, the Washington Commanders are signing Terry McLaurin to a 3-year contract extension worth up to $71 million in new money. That also gives him a $28 million signing bonus, which is the largest amount ever given to any wide receiver, and also has a 76.4% guarantee of the new money that is being given to him. Now, this is as a result of Terry McLaurin skipping the first 3 weeks of voluntary OTAs and the team's mandatory 3-day minicamp. So this obviously is a great way to avoid a huge headache going into this season, because I'd say the Washington Commanders have probably their best quarterback since maybe Alex Smith or Kirk Cousins in the form of Carson Wentz. I'd say the Washington Commanders have definitely upgraded their quarterback position, although not so much. The bonus for Terry McLaurin is pretty awesome, but when you compare it to the other contracts that were paid out over this offseason, it isn't even in the top 5. I mean, if you're ranking the highest paid wide receivers in the NFL, you start out with Tyreek Hill, that got paid $30 million a year for a total of $120 million, with $72.2 million guaranteed. Then of course Davante Adams, the man that started all this, a 5-year contract worth $141.25 million. DeAndre Hopkins didn't get extended this past year, but was already number 3 by getting paid an average of $27.25 million. Then of course there was the Cooper Kupp contract extension, where Cooper Kupp was paid a 3-year extension worth $80 million, including $75 million in guarantees. Then there was of course AJ Brown, who was traded on the night of the NFL draft to the Philadelphia Eagles, and then was paid $100 million with $40 million guaranteed over 4 years. And then of course Stephon Diggs, who was paid $104 million over 4 years and $70 million in guarantees. So it's not necessarily in the top 5 of wide receivers, or the top 6 for that matter, but considering how inflated wide receiver contracts became over this past offseason, I think this is incredible for Terry McLaurin. He gets 76% of the money in the extension, fully guaranteed. That's more money than most players players make in the NFL, and for that, we should be very happy for him. Now we get to the point where this video gets very bizarre. I mean, we've been making videos on Dan Snyder, and every time we make a video on Dan Snyder, I wonder if there's something going on with the YouTube algorithm, because they tend to demonetize my content sometimes. But that's because of the workplace misconduct that took place behind the scenes with the Washington Commanders. If you guys haven't been familiar with it over the past year, we've made a couple of videos on some really outrageous stuff that Dan Snyder has been accused of. I mean, this goes all the way back to May of 2018, where Washington Commanders cheerleaders made allegations in the New York Times report. Man, the New York Times really sabotages a lot of people in the NFL. I'm just starting to notice, because the New York Times has also been reporting on Deshaun Watson. But pretty much in this report, cheerleaders were very uncomfortable and intimidated by team sponsors during a 2013 trip to Costa Rica for a swimsuit calendar photo shoot. The cheerleaders told the Times that male sponsors and suite holders were invited for up-close access to a photo shoot where the women were required to be topless or wear only body paint. And 9 of the 36 cheerleaders were required to be personal escorts for sponsors at a nightclub. The direct quote is, "They weren't putting a gun to our heads, but it was mandatory for us to go. We weren't asked, but we were told." This resulted in the president of business operations, Dennis Green, resigning after 17 years with the team. The team would then pledge to be more family friendly after an investigation into the cheerleader accusations. And the first step in this was firing the team president, Bruce Allen. Now, if you're wondering why Bruce Allen sounds so familiar, it's because the investigation into Bruce Allen, who happens to be BFFs with John Gruden, would result in John Gruden having to step down and resign after a leaked email of him saying DeMaurice Smith, but called him DeMaurice Smith, having lips the size of Michelin tires. And then when John Gruden didn't step down, there were even additional emails leaked of him saying some homophobic stuff, insulting Roger Goodell. It was a whole thing that all resulted from the NFL doing research into Bruce Allen because of workplace misconduct. Things were relatively quiet until 2 summers ago, where we heard that 17 women made allegations in a Washington Post report in which 17 women, including 15 former team employees, mentioned that they were harassed by members of the Washington football team. This literally included a video of broadcaster Larry Michael, who was heard on mic in 2018, talking about the attractiveness of a college-aged intern.
I do think our intern is looking better every day. I do think our intern is a little blonde there talking.
Then, a few weeks later, there were specific allegations against Dan Snyder from 25 additional women, including former cheerleaders, former video producers, unnamed former employees that were bringing up videos against Dan Snyder in 2010. And it wasn't only against Dan Snyder. You've been hearing things about Bruce Allen, about Larry Michael, and ultimately several women made allegations of sexual harassment and a toxic workplace culture. The NFL would eventually take over the investigation that originally started by Beth Wilkinson in 2020, and you wouldn't really hear much until late in 2020. It was found that Dan Snyder paid $1.6 million in 2009 to settle misconduct allegations. Then there was a settlement that was reached over the videos that were taken in 2010 and 2008. The team would eventually drop their cheerleading program a year ago, and the NFL would levy one of the most historic punishments against any NFL team of all time, where they would fine the Washington football team $10 million after it was found that there was a highly unprofessional workplace, including frequent examples of bullying, intimidation, and sexual harassment. Owner Dan Snyder said in a statement that he takes responsibility for the team's workplace and agrees with the league's decisions and recommendations for changes. He relinquished day-to-day operations of the team to his wife, which was reportedly a voluntary decision. The NFL said that this will last at least the next several months, and the big controversy that came out of this was the fact that there was no public report about any of this at all whatsoever. And the amount that the Washington football team was fined, although to us it it sounds like a lot of money. We're talking about the NFL, and Dan Snyder is a billionaire. So $10 million doesn't necessarily mean so much to him. Even furthermore, none of the reports of this investigation were made public. It was all kept in-house, except, of course, the email involving John Gruden using the racist trope in 2021. Over this past year, there would be pressure for the Wilkinson report to be more public before in December, apparently Dan Snyder would try to interfere with the report by allegedly trying to prevent a woman who had been paid $1.6 million in a confidential settlement stemming from a misconduct allegation against Snyder in 2009 from speaking with Wilkinson, including offering additional money. Court records obtained by the Post show that the woman did eventually speak with Wilkinson. Now, Goodell would actually say that this is not true and it did not happen. In February, there would be a brand new allegation specifically against Dan Snyder, where a former cheerleader and marketing manager, Tiffany Johnston, accused Snyder of touching her inappropriately 2 different times at a work dinner event. She said Snyder placed his hand on her thigh under the table until she moved his hand away and then approached her after dinner and put his arm around her, inviting her into his limo. She said that she refused, but he persisted aggressively, pushing her toward the limo until his lawyer intervened, saying, "Dan, very bad idea. Dan, very, very bad idea." And I mean, bad idea. Former employees would then speak in Congress about the situation that would go down. And this brings us all the way to the stuff that we heard in April, where Dan Snyder reportedly withheld money from the NFL and withheld security deposits from fans and kept 2 sets of books to hide revenue from the NFL. So not only has Dan Snyder been accused of treating women poorly and of course misconduct, but on top of that, he's been accused of screwing over his business partners by literally withholding revenue that is supposed to be shared between all the teams, which, by the way, with all due respect, the Washington football team, or the Washington Commanders, have been a poverty franchise over the past 2 decades. I mean, this team has not been really freaking good consistently, except for some outliers, since Dan Snyder took over. So the fact that there's revenue sharing in place to actually help Dan Snyder get a return on his investment benefits Snyder. But of course, due to his greed, he ended up withholding everything. So this brings us to June 15th, 2022, where Dan Snyder declines Congress's invitation to testify, but Roger Goodell would accept and actually would defend Dan Snyder in these hearings. Congress would ask Roger Goodell to release the report. Once again, Roger Goodell would not release the report, which brings us to a week ago where Congress subpoenaed Dan Snyder, and Dan Snyder refused the subpoena. Now, you might be wondering, how's he refusing the subpoena? Well, in order to subpoena someone, you have to directly interact with them in person and hand them a sheet of paper and say, "Yo, dude, you've been subpoenaed." Dan Snyder currently is on a yacht in the middle of sea, which makes it impossible for anyone to approach him. I mean, there's literally a Twitter account called Dan Snyder's Yacht Tracker that is showing where Dan Snyder currently is. Now, he's currently in France and he's refusing to go. So this entire situation is absolutely absurd, and it's a horrible look for the Washington football team. I'm kind of shocked that Roger Goodell's defending Snyder. I'm assuming there's a lot of information that is just way worse than what we already know. So let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think about all this, man. I hope this could bring you up to date as to what's going on in the case. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.